Hello. Hello, friends. It's your buddy Joel. I'm trying to figure out live streaming. I've never done it before, and I don't know what I'm doing. But here's the agenda for today. I have a true crime story you've probably never heard about before. Even if you're the most diehard true crimer ever, you don't know about this one. I know about it though. It's called the case of Darrel Parker. It's out of Lincoln, Nebraska, 1955, and I'm here to tell you all about it. It's quite a journey. Couple things. I am willing to sing for money. Usually, it is someone from Journey, like a Journey song, or maybe a Queen song, or some other song that I know the words to. I will sing for money. Sounds fun. Um, Also, I have more lives I want to do. I'll tell you about the next case I'm probably going to do. It's not a criminal case, though. Not really. It's a civil rights case, and it's a real case. Involves a guy named Dan Retz. And these are all from my own legal experience. I'm an attorney. I'm a man. I'm 40 years old, and I'm a dog dad. My dog's name is Ziggy. We're coming to you from Omaha, Nebraska, and I've done YouTube for 4 years. I finally got monetized. I've never done a live stream, and that probably has held me back. But I have 1,000 videos. I have like a handful of LawTube videos, and I did I did some videos on the Reid case. That's probably one of my favorite true crime cases of all time, just because it's so crazy. Although I think nothing can beat OJ. OJ is going to be the GOAT true crime case forever, in my opinion. But let's transition in to the cold open. This is the Darrel Parker case. So in 1955, a young husband in Lincoln, Nebraska came home from lunch and found his wife dead in their bedroom. Within days, police brought in a famous Chicago interrogation expert. His name was John E. Reid. For the big true crime junkies, you'd have to be pretty legit to know this, but if that name sounds familiar, John Reid, it should, because Reid was one of the most influential figures in American police interrogation history, and not in a good way. So by the end of that night, Darrel had confessed to the murder of his wife, Nancy. And for decades, it looked like the confession was the end of the case. But it wasn't the answer, it was just the trap. Because, as we know, standing here today in 2026, Darrel Parker did not kill his wife, Nancy. Darrel spent 14 years in prison, and he was convicted, and that conviction stood for decades. But another man later confessed. And the state of Nebraska eventually publicly apologized to Darrel Parker and agreed to pay him the maximum allowed under a new law that compensated people who are wrongfully convicted, which was $500,000. Here's the wildest part about this, and we'll get into it. But a big reason why Darrel was able to win his case, and by the way, I was on Darrel's legal team, as I'll explain more, but it's because the state of Nebraska, when they were defending this, they were defending our claim for compensation for being wrongfully convicted, but they made a huge mess up, and it was in part of their own mess up that helped Darrel win his case. What happened was there's a provision in the law that says if you perjure yourself, you're basically barred from seeking compensation for a wrongful conviction. And I'll give you a scenario to explain what that means. So let's say someone dies, and so your hypothetical dude, let's call him Bingo Smith, walks into the sheriff's office and says, "I did it." And then he says, "Wait a minute, you arrested me and I didn't do it and I can prove it." Well, Bingo, it was your fault. You shouldn't have confessed. That's not what this is meant for. This is meant for people who actually are accused, convicted, and can be proved later to be actually innocent. But it cannot be brought about by someone as a scam. Bingo was just trying to scam, but it was his own fault that he was wrongfully convicted. And so, what the state tried to do, the state of Nebraska, they tried to apply that type of argument to Darrel. And so they said, "You confessed. You know what? Your confession was false." Oops, because that means logically he didn't kill his wife. If you say your confession to killing your wife was false, logically that means he was innocent. And so that was almost like an unbelievable mess up by a lawyer in the state attorney general's office. So I'm going to transition into telling you more about the story of this Nebraska case that you true crime and YouTube and LawTube lovers should know about. It's a story about a young couple, a brutal crime, a suspicious black Ford, that famous interrogator I mentioned from Chicago, a mysterious glass of milk, a confession that did not fit the evidence, and that legal mistake I talked about that helped right a historic wrong. This is the Darrel Parker case. So before I get into the timeline about what went down in 1955, quick personal note. So, like I said, I'm a lawyer. I got my license in 2013. So, I've been an attorney for 13 years. But when you're in law school, they allow you to start working in your second year. And so, I spent about 10 hours a week working at a personal injury firm in Lincoln, Nebraska. And this was literally the first case that I ever worked on. It was as a professional, I didn't have my license at the time, but they let you do something that's called like your senior certified, or it basically means you're a student under the supervision of a real attorney. So I couldn't do that much, but I did go to real hearings. And I worked on the case. Like, I helped investigate this case. One of the things that I did was I pulled the microfiche. That's right, a microfiche of Lincoln newspapers at the end of 1955 and 1956, which covered this trial that Darrel Parker had. So I assessed all the publicly available information at the time and compared that to Parker's confession and another guy's confession that we'll talk about later. But just know I was personally involved and I have a duty to maintain confidences and everything. And I'm not going to go into any private or confidential matters, but I do have a lot of insight, and this is just an amazing case. So what I'll talk about is the publicly available information, the story, the trial testimony, the public articles, newspaper reporting. I'll give you a sense of the litigation history and what was happening in the courts, both back in the day. There's kind of like a middle period. There's some stuff that happened like around the late 70s and then all the way back into the 2010s. Also, I'll talk a little bit about the history of America with these confession problems, because this is, like I said, with John Reid, this was kind of an institution for police to go from. They were essentially evolving from the time of, I'm just going to physically beat up suspects and get confessions with them that way, to psychologically take them over and make them say things that are not true. And so Essentially, this story has 3 levels. It'll be like your favorite true crime sandwich. Of course, the key to every sandwich is fresh, delicious bread. You can't have a good sandwich without bread. And then also, you got to have something in the middle. There's got to be meat in that sandwich. Even if you're a vegetarian, you could be tofu. There's got to be something in the middle. And what I'm bringing to you, all 3 parts are going to be good. Layer number 1, this is the true crime aspect. This is about what happened to a young woman named Nancy Parker in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1955. And then the investigation, as you probably know, the first suspect in a murder is almost always the spouse or boyfriend. I'm going to try to be careful. It's YouTube. I'm not really a YouTube savant, but there are certain terms that you should and shouldn't use just to help the algorithm or advertisers or whatever. So I'll just kind of dabble around. I probably don't really know what I'm doing, but if I say something like SA or red rum, you all will know what that means. So Nancy, she wasn't simply just found dead, but she was strangled in her own home, and her body was bound with rope and also a cord, like with a appliance, like an electric cord. And those details are important because the case was later examined with really great care based on what happened at the scene and whether the information in the confession matched the physical evidence. So layer number 2, like I talked about, this is the interrogation aspect. This is where John E. Reid comes from Chicago, and he gets a confession from Darrel. That's the key to the case. It was the key to what got Darrel convicted, and it was the key to what got Darrel his wrongful conviction apology and compensation. Then layer 3 is kind of more the legal story. Many decades later, not until probably around 2009, Nebraska created a wrongful conviction statute. And Darrel Parker was one of the first people who sued under that statute. He sued the state of Nebraska, and everything turned on the confession, Darrel's words. What was repeated over and over again for years and years and years in America, in the criminal justice system, is that people did not confess to crimes that they didn't commit. That's the logic. That's the exact logic that got Darrel convicted in the first place. But it's also a dangerous myth because we now know with tons of data that people do confess to crimes they didn't commit for different reasons. And one of them is psychological pressure. By the end, I think you'll see why this case is an important false confession case, true crime case. So for example, if you watched Making of a Murderer, that is probably one of my favorite true crime documentaries. Really, for me, it's because Stephen Avery had the 2 cases. That's why it was fascinating to me. And he was wrongfully convicted the first time. And so for him to be prosecuted again, that's why I thought it was so crazy. But what the Darrel Parker case reminds me of is the Brandon Dassey interrogation. It is actually, if you watch that interrogation, it is some of the same exact tactics that police learned through people like John Reid, who wrote manuals on this, on different things you're supposed to do, like suggest facts, get them cornered in a room, get them outnumbered, get them cut off from family members and attorneys, do a lot of like good cop, bad cop, sympathetic reasoning, and things like that can just totally take over and control how someone in a vulnerable position thinks and what they're willing to do to get out of trouble. So this, you also might be familiar with the decision Miranda versus Arizona, 1966 SCOTUS decision, that is the reason why today police say you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. You have a right to attorney, things like that. And that came directly from what was known as a machinery of coerced confessions, this John Reid manual and playbook designed to get ordinary members of the public to confess to things that they didn't do. So, chapter 1, the young couple in Lincoln. Darrel Parker himself was not a hardened criminal. He was a young, educated man, and he was the city forester of Lincoln, Nebraska. He graduated from Iowa State, which is where he met Nancy. And in 1954, that's when Darrel started working for the city of Lincoln, and Nancy joined him in Lincoln in 1955. And they lived in a remote home near Antelope Park. That detail, the fact that they lived in a remote home, kind of explains part of how this case, the mystery of this case, I will say. It's like there's this young couple. They're just out of college. They're in a new city, and they're starting to form a life. And Darrel is getting involved in the local community. On December 14th, 1955, Darrel left for work, and he and Nancy had eaten breakfast before 7 o'clock. He left for work around 7:15 or so, and he had a busy day. He had some errands to run. He was supposed to help decorate a city Christmas tree. And so he did that, and then he came home for lunch, which was his habit every day, come home to see Nancy for lunch. But when he returned home, which was a few minutes after noon that day, something was wrong, and he noticed that his ordinary routine was off. They had a dog. The dog wasn't behaving normally. The shades in the house were off. There was no meal which he was expecting. And then he went into the bedroom and he found Nancy. So Nancy, she had been killed by strangulation. Her hands were bound behind her back with a cord and rope, and there was multiple different bindings around her neck. So that's the physical evidence at the scene. And there was also SA. This is what the different investigators and lawyers and people who are really interested in false convictions and wrongful convictions ended up researching, because there was a written confession made by Darrel to compare again and try to match or not with the physical evidence. So obviously you're wondering, this is the question, the same question everyone wants to know in every true crime case pretty much, is who did it? That is a big question in this case, but there's another question, is once there was a false confession, or once there was a confession, could anything else realistically have happened once investigators had that confession? Could they have considered anyone else? And the thinking at the time was no. That was it. That was game, set, match right there, because people who confess to bad things wouldn't say it unless it was true. That was the thinking. But early on, there were facts that pointed away from Darrel. Like I said, there was the SA that didn't match Darrel, and there was also questions about this black Ford that was seen near the house. So there was a suspect at the time that wasn't Darrel. Even so, everything focused on Darrel's confession. Almost everything else got pulled right into that confession, almost like a black hole where you couldn't see anything else. So no sunlight got through. So I mentioned the black Ford. This is technically chapter 2 in my notes. Before the confession, one of the biggest leads was a black car. Newspaper summaries, they described a lead involving a 1949 or 1950 black two-door Ford seen near the Parker house around 7:40 a.m. The Lincoln Journal called that the best clue, and witnesses more than once said they thought it was a 1949 Ford that was black. So they kind of narrowed it down pretty specifically. Later, the defense found that a man named Wesley Peery had a 1949 black Ford. And during the trial, the defense introduced that into evidence. And there was a witness named Bonnie Tassell. She said she saw a dark car, probably a 1949 Ford, about 1 block east from the Parker residence around 7 a.m. So that testimony connected Wesley Peery to a black Ford sedan. And so this guy Peery, he wasn't a random name. He had worked for the city park department, and he had been released from the Nebraska penitentiary, and he was later convicted of serious crimes. There's public records that show he had a violent criminal background, and he had been convicted of SA right at the same time of Darrel's trial. So imagine you're a detective, put on your Blue's Clues hat, and there's this young woman who's killed in a remote home. Some witnesses see a dark Ford. So that leads to this guy, Wesley Peery. He'd been in the area and he had a violent record. And still, the confession is what this initial trial focused on. So the question isn't really, was there another suspect, but how much evidence do you need to overcome a confession? Chapter 3, this is the prosecution theory. So the prosecutor's name at the time was Lancaster County Attorney Elmer Scheel. He thought this was a crime of passion, and they pretty much committed to that theory. They said it was a domestic crime. They said that the essay was more seemed like staging by Darrel and misdirection. And the only person that made sense to them was the husband. But like I said, the physical evidence didn't really match that prosecution theory. There was death by strangulation, and there was multiple cords around her neck and wrists with specific knots. That was also part of the evidence, is what kind of knot was in the rope and cords. And it didn't really match anything that Darrel knew about. There was some ejaculate on Nancy's upper thigh, but still the state didn't say there was SA. They really didn't explain that. They didn't account for that in the prosecution theory. What the prosecution said was that he killed Nancy in a fit of rage and then staged the scene to look like an essay or robbery. And so that was how the state said, nothing to see here about the essay. So again, goes back to the importance of power of a confession and also how the confession was extracted. It's known as custodial interrogation, which we will get into now. This is chapter 4. Enter John E. Reid. So on December 20th, this is a little less than a week after Nancy's death, Darrel was staying with Nancy's parents in Iowa after her funeral, and he got a call telling him to come to Lincoln so he would assist with in the investigation. So he came back to Lincoln the next morning. And so that meant he had been traveling, and obviously he thought he was going to be there to help. But when he arrived, he met John E. Reid, who was a former FBI interrogator and a Chicago criminalist. So Reid was not brought in as a neutral guy. He was specifically brought in to get the confession of Darrel, specifically. The reason why Reid is a known guy is because he came up with something called the Reid technique, and he wrote manuals about it. The Reid method and instruction manuals are part of this big conversation about custodial interrogation. Like I said, in Miranda v. Arizona, the U.S. Supreme Court discussed Reid's specific police interrogation manuals, including coercive custodial interrogation. And at the very end, I'm going to read you a little bit from the Miranda opinion, because it's funny. Like, I am a law nerd, and I would never guess that one of the landmark decisions by SCOTUS has some kind of connection to where I'm from. I'm originally from Omaha, Nebraska, and this is in Lincoln, but this same character, John Reid, came to Lincoln and got a false confession from Darrel. It's pretty wild. And this is part of the American story. It was before DNA exonerations really showed the problem, and before people had phones and videos and everything. This was the situation that Darrel faced. He was in a small room. He was by himself. He was grieving. He had just traveled from out of town. He talked about what Reid did to him. He said Reid was relentless. He was extremely physically close. He would touch him under the chin, stroke his hair, tell Parker to look at him in the eyes, telling him, "You killed Nancy," saying, "You can't beat the machine." And there was also a missing watch. That was part of the case. And Parker testified that Reid told him he came to Lincoln to get a confession, and he would get one no matter what, whether it took 3 days or a week. Chapter 5, the glass of milk. This is a creepy detail, because you can go in to the records about Darrel's case, and you can read his confession. And one of the really creepy things that happened is this glass of milk. So during the interrogation, Parker asked for a glass of milk, and he had not eaten since that morning, and he had been interrogated for like 12 hours, from 6:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. Parker testified that Reid poured a glass of milk in a way that Darrel couldn't see it. And then it was after Parker had a sandwich and a glass of milk, he became sleepy, groggy, and his memory started getting foggy. And Darrel kind of remembers questions about how his memories just kind of go in and out. He only remembers little details, like people asking him questions over and over again. People asking him, "How did you tie this knot? What knot was this?" And people saying, "Oh, change this, change that, add this, add that." And he can kind of remember the physical mannerisms or gestations, but it's all a fog. He doesn't really know. And I'm not saying that there was something in the milk, but I'm not saying I can prove it, and that was never proven. That wasn't part of the wrongful conviction compensation. No one ever said the milk was poisoned or drugged or something, but it does seem like it was. To get him into a suggestible state, to get his defenses down so he would finally give up. And like Reid, or like Darrel testified, Reid told him, I'm going to get this confession no matter what, as long as it takes. That's what I'm here for. I came from Chicago for this, so that's what I'm going to do. So if you want to know more, I encourage you to go look up the milk thing. It's, like I said, it was never proven, but it's very logical. And especially when I read from the Miranda opinion, it totally fits the game plan discussed in there. So let's see. Chapter 6, people did not confess to things they did not do, quote unquote. For much of American history, that was the mantra. And it kind of feels, in a way, like it makes sense, but that is the trick. Because you just think of yourself and you say, I wouldn't do something that I did, or I wouldn't say I did something that I didn't do. But it all depends on what situation you're in and what options you have. There's abundance of research that shows people do confess to things they didn't do. Sometimes they're trying to escape pressure. Sometimes they're exhausted. They're scared. They're isolated. Maybe they're physically weak or young, or maybe they're under the influence of some drugs. Maybe they're grieving because their spouse just died, or maybe at some point they think, well, I don't remember doing it, but I must have, because these people are pretty serious. Sometimes, like in the Brendan Dassey case, I think it was shown that he repeated things that were fed to him. And also, I do remember, like, he kept guessing, and the interrogators got mad because he kept guessing wrong. So then they finally just told him. So in that, again, in the Brendan Dassey interrogation, people saw like leading questions, pressure, confusion. Confusion is a big one. You're just kind of like disoriented, and you have the police have the good cop, bad cop tag team. They'll say things to you to try to make you think like it'll be okay. Everything will be okay. Is if you just confess, then everything will go back to normal and make it seem like it's not a big deal. This is the psychological breaking down of people rather than just beating it out of them. It's kind of beating on their mind until a confession comes out. So that game plan is all recognizable directly from John Reid. The interrogators dominate the room. The suspect is told, we already know you're guilty, and any confession, or sorry, any denials that you give are just rejected, and any innocent explanations you try to give are shut down. The counter narrative that fits the case is given, and the interrogators get the suspect to correct certain details almost as a trick to make it seem like this was a thought through, careful, voluntary statement. Because look, they fixed that there's something wrong in there and they fix it. So that means this is true. But that's part of the trick. That's designed as kind of an artificial way to add some credibility to it. It's a manufactured statement, and it's trying to use the statement itself to prove that the statement is credible. So that's one of the big lessons in this case, is how confessions are extracted, how they work, what they might look like, what are the methods, what are the consequences, and how can it be undone. Chapter 7, the confession that did not fit. So, one of the things that lawyers do when they look at confessions is ask, does this contain reliable information, something that the public wouldn't know, but the perpetrator would? And is it accurate, something that the true offender would be in a position to confirm? In other words, does the confession prove itself? And that's what, for people who want a confession, they want a confession that's going to be able to prove itself. And there were problems with Darrel's confession. There were several incorrect details. Darrel, his statement said that there was brown twine from the basement that he used, but there was twine around Nancy's neck and it wasn't brown. Also, he said that he did one knot, but there was multiple knots. And also he said he did a slip knot, he later changed it to a double bowline knot. Either way, it just didn't match what Darrel would have done as a forester's knot. There was also random things about, like, he was summarizing like what he did that day in his confession, and it didn't match what actually happened. And there was other witnesses. Like I said, he had a busy day. He was working for the city of Lincoln, putting up a Christmas tree, and the written confession didn't match what other witnesses were able to say he actually did that day. And like I said, there's actually more corrections. The corrections are supposed to show this is something Parker understands, and he's making a conscious effort, involuntary effort to confess. And it also means he read it, he understood it, he signed it. But corrections are just a way to kind of CYA. It's a way to artificially bolster a statement, because maybe part of the confession is weak. Maybe it just doesn't make sense. You're just not buying it. But if it's inaccurate, you go in there, make some changes, do a little initialing, and then it makes it look like, okay, there was some thought put into this. Parker specifically said that Reid there was a court reporter in the interrogation room, and he specifically said that Reid told the court reporter to make mistakes, so that he could later change them, like the knots. So when you're evaluating a confession, you have to ask, where did the details come from? Did they come from the suspect, or were they incepted by the police? Or maybe this is just something that someone read, and it's in their imaginations getting carried away with them. Maybe there is some kind of contamination with the memory. There's all different, you want to find the source of the details, and was it sort of an organic relaying of someone's experience, or was it manufactured and it had to be led? So this is part of the mystery of this case, is Parker's confession, and where did these details come from? All right, Chapter 8, we'll go to the trial. So Parker went to trial in 1956, and his trial was 3.5 weeks. The state's case was all about the confession. The defense attacked the confession and pointed to evidence that didn't fit the state's theory. The defense discussed the black Ford, and they had an expert that testified that the SA would have been inconsistent with the spouse being the suspect. There's also questions about the time of death, if Darrel was seen doing setting up the Christmas tree during the kind of mid-morning time, and that timeline perhaps didn't match the time of death, and other inconsistencies in the confession. Pretty much as it turned out, once the jurors heard that there was confession, that drove the case. On May 3rd, 1956, Darrel Parker was convicted of first-degree homicide. He was sentenced to life. Thank God he was not sentenced to death. So after the criminal case is done, now what we have left is to talk about what are thought of as civil proceedings to get Darrel compensated, to get Darrel forgiven. But it's not just about compensation. It's literally about Darrel's survival. Because had he been sentenced to death, the later apology that the Nebraska Attorney General gave to Darrel may have never happened. Chapter 9, Prison Habeas and the Deal No Innocent Person Should Have to Make. Parker spent nearly 14 years in prison for being convicted of homicide of his wife, Nancy. Now, eventually, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, it's a federal appellate court, ruled that the confession was involuntary, and he was released. But the U.S. Supreme Court gave directions for a new hearing, which is known as a Jackson-Deno hearing, which is essentially a hearing about whether a confession was voluntary or involuntary. So he, even though he was released, he was about to have a hearing to determine the validity of his confession. So think of the human aspect of that. He'd already been in jail for 14 years, and he had a chance to challenge the confession, but if the hearing didn't go his way, he'd be right back in the prison system. And by then, the man who prosecuted him, Scheel, was a judge. So Parker was terrified of being sent back to prison, so he made a deal. And when we were litigating this case, we often thought that this seemed like a catch-22 to us. You can either have it proven that your confession was false, or if you don't go all the way and just make a deal, you can get rid of your life sentence and you can be paroled and you can be out of jail. But if you want to do that, you have to withdraw your challenge to the confession. So that was the deal that Parker did. And when we get into the compensation for wrongful conviction part, this was part of the state's argument against him, is he didn't litigate the full voluntariness of his confession at the time. He took a deal, and this is just a totally brutal choice to have to make, especially if you're innocent. Do you keep fighting, risking that you'll go back to prison for something you didn't do, or do you take a path that gets you out, even if the conviction technically is still in place? So at that time, Parker took the deal, but he was not cleared of the murder. Chapter 10, Wesley Peery. So there is another twist to this story, and that was in 1988. Before dying in prison, Wesley Peery confessed to Nancy Parker's essay and murder. Remember, this was a suspect from the beginning. Newspaper articles around the time talked about the black Ford as one of the best clues in the case. He had worked for the state, I think, or just in public service. And he had that criminal record at the same time all of this was going on. So what did Peery know? Because he confessed. So where did the details from his confession come from? Did he know anything that wasn't publicly available that only the defender would know? And that's when the analysis that we did becomes important. Like I said, I looked at the Lincoln Journal and the Lincoln Star, two different newspapers, and I got articles from very late 1955 and 1956 to show what had been publicly reported about the trial. So, and it was to compare against Peery's confession to see if he knew anything that wasn't publicly known. So he knew that one of the ropes that was used to bind Nancy was taken from the cabinet. He also talked about some, like how the bedroom was laid out, like the different furniture. And he also talked about some ropes that were being frayed, and that he actually like broke like this rather than cutting it like this. So these are pretty specific details that weren't publicly reported. The test is what he's saying accurate, and how does he know? And so when you have those facts, and you go back to analyze Darrel's confession, it makes it all the more fascinating, and you get more of a complete picture, and you can then you have more than one confession to compare, and your analysis gets a lot stronger. So with this new evidence, Parker asked for a pardon. He'd been out of custody, but given that someone else confessed for the crime, the person who actually did it, Parker asked for a pardon, and the Nebraska Board of Pardons unanimously granted Darrel Parker a pardon in 1991. But a pardon is not the same thing as being declared innocent. A pardon is like forgiveness. It's saying, we forgive you, but technically you're still on the record for having done this. So Parker wanted his name cleared. Chapter 11, pardon is not exoneration. The true crime lovers know about this. A pardon is mercy. It can be political. It's forgiveness, but not forgetting. It doesn't necessarily say you didn't do this. So Darrel Parker, that was really important to him. He didn't want to just be out of prison. He also wanted the state to recognize that his conviction was wrong, and he wanted the public to know what the truth was. So for a long time, Darrel didn't really have any legal avenues to get what he wanted. But in 2009, Nebraska passed the Wrongful Conviction Act. And under that act, Darrel, it's a tough claim to prove. There's some really hard elements to prove in there. But he essentially had to prove his confession was false, it was coerced, and that he was actually innocent. This is hard, though, because we're in 2009, 2010, and this happened in 1955. So you're going to need witnesses from back then. You're going to need evidence. And it's just so hard to disprove a conviction because all of the default rules are in place to make sure the conviction stands. That's kind of the default. It is possible to overturn them, but the way the system is set up is so trials are essentially final and we don't have to do this again. Otherwise, we wouldn't get anything done because, as bad as that sounds, that's kind of the whole point is, assuming fairness and due process and things like that, which is assuming a lot. It might be, in some cases, assuming everything. There should be a final point to a case, and that's kind of the default rules. So one of the big changes, though, is 2009 when Nebraska passed this new law. This is when this is kind of close to around the time that I got involved in the case. I would say I probably got involved in 2011. And so this wrongful conviction case has been filed and been moving forward a little bit in the litigation. And by this time, the state had moved for summary judgment. And one of its arguments was that Parker's deal in the 70s, remember that kind of catch-22 decision he had to make. Do I challenge my confession or do I go home today? The state was arguing that he didn't challenge it, so he can't claim to be actually innocent. But this is where this ridiculous mistake happened. Someone in the Nebraska Attorney General's office wrote this brief, and I still remember it. It was all about how Parker falsely confessed to killing his wife. That was a huge game changer, because one of the hardest thing to prove, because the case was so old, was that he was actually innocent. And the burden of proof was high. It was required clear and convincing evidence. And so when the case pretty much admitted that he falsely confessed to killing his wife, logically, that proved the hardest element for Darrel. And that's why we call it a goal line fumble, because the state was trying to make this legal argument about how the old deal was precluding Darrel from getting compensation under this act. But in doing so, it helped Parker prove the hardest element, which is his actual innocence. So the state tried to withdraw that motion, but a momentum change, and it's not like the court actually ruled on this brief that the state filed and said, aha, you gave away the whole game. But the court didn't need to, because it was such an obvious mistake, and kind of the momentum and the public sentiment change, and it made the state go back and look and take this case a lot more seriously, because obviously that the main argument they did try completely backfired. So like I said, it's not that the judge ruled against them on this, but it's almost like it was such a bad mistake that no one had to rule on it, because everyone could tell this is egg on their face. Okay, so here comes the apology, which is a great part of the wrongful conviction relief that Darrel got. 3 days after the summary judgment hearing, this is August 2012, Parker's lawyer got a call from that saying that they wanted to meet with the Nebraska Attorney General. And on August 31st, 2012, the state of Nebraska publicly apologized to Darrel Parker and entered an offer of judgment for $500,000, which is the maximum allowed under the statute. There was some comments from the Attorney General saying that they did review some additional evidence, and they said it was crystal clear that Parker was innocent. Parker, he was a little elderly at the time. He said that he could die in peace. And so that's a happy ending, as much as you can have when there's a homicide and a wrongful conviction. But, Nancy is still gone. Darrel lost years of his life. The system that we trusted used a false confession to convict someone innocent, which did massive damage, but years and years later, the right person confessed. So there is still some power in a public apology saying, we made a mistake, this is our bad. And there's still hope that Darrel lived long enough and went through the process, and long enough for evidence to come out and for the laws to change, that Darrel ultimately did get some justice. So, Chapter 14, why this case matters now. False confessions are not an old problem. Northwestern has a center of wrongful conviction and has identified false and coerced confessions as a major cause of wrongful convictions. Stephen Dreisen and Richard Leo's research found many false confessions followed long interrogations, and this center has helped bring national attention to this playbook of false confessions. A massive audience saw the Brendan Dassey case. Vulnerable people can agree with facts that are suggested to them, and they're just trying to make the interrogator happy because they're so bombarded and confused that nothing makes sense anymore, and they're trying to figure out what is it going to take to get this person out of my face. So they'll say and do whatever they can to relieve that pressure. Darrel's case is a real case that has historical relevance. It involved a famous interrogator, and like I mentioned, there was the milk, there was the long delay with no food, there was facts suggested to him, there was corrections that were forced on him, and despite problems of like the essay and some of the other evidence about the knots and decades of delay, even an alternative suspect, still the state apologized. So let's see. Sort of to wrap up, I'm going to wrap up this story and then I'll read a little bit of Miranda versus Arizona. But what did we just learn here? Well, we talked about there was this young couple right out of college in Lincoln, Nebraska, Darrel and Nancy Parker. They were building a life together. Darrel was the city forester, came home for lunch, found that Nancy was killed in their home. What followed was the early evidence. There was the 1949 black Ford, indications of SA, and Darrel being called back. He was out of town in Iowa, visiting Nancy's family when John Reid was brought from Chicago to Lincoln specifically with the task of getting a confession. The jury convicted Darrel on that confession in 1956, and he spent 14 years in prison. Then, with more development in America about custodial interrogation, the fact that people do give false confessions, that people do confess to things that they didn't do. There's the Hobson's choice of being faced with the decision of, do I clear my name now, even though the prosecutor is now a judge? Or do I avoid taking that risk and I go home today? Then what was pretty ironic is Darrel's words is ultimately what saved him, because the state said that he falsely confessed. And as a result, in 2012, Nebraska publicly apologized to him and offered him the statutory maximum of $500,000. The lesson is not just that Darrel was innocent, but that a confession can be powerful, persuasive, and wrong. A confession can make investigators stop looking. It can make jurors stop doubting. It can make inconsistencies in the physical evidence seem unimportant. It can make an innocent person guilty for the rest of their life. And it's funny that it was ultimately a mistake by the state. They agreed with what Darrel was saying the whole time. He had falsely confessed. He was innocent. So if this case surprised you, I want you to share it with your fellow true crime lovers or your favorite LawTube influencers. I personally like Ian Runkle and I don't know. I think everyone in moderation. I think everyone in moderation is fun. Broken Baker, even though he's not a lawyer, he he makes some sense, and he's pretty funny, and I like his singing. And so in the future, I didn't get any, like, I don't think anyone has viewed this or chatted or anything because I don't know what I'm doing. But in the future, I will sing for cash. Broken Baker doesn't do that, but I do. He sings, but not by request. So I will, as long as it's a song I know. Okay, let's wrap up, but I'll read you a little bit from Miranda versus Arizona. And so this is starting on page 448. This is an opinion from 1966. We stress that the modern practice of in-custody interrogation is psychologically rather than physically oriented. As we've stated before, this court has recognized that coercion can be mental as well as physical, and that the blood of the accused is not the only hallmark of an unconstitutional inquisition. Interrogation still takes place in privacy. Privacy results in secrecy, and this in turn results in a gap in our knowledge as to what in fact goes on in the interrogation rooms. A valuable source of information about police practices, however, may be found in various police manuals and texts, which document procedures employed with success in the past and which recommend various other effective tactics. These texts are used by law enforcement and agencies themselves as guides. It should be noted that these texts professedly present the most enlightened and effective means presently used to obtain statements through custodial interrogation. By considering these texts and other data, it's possible to describe procedures observed and noted around the country. The officers are told by the manuals that the principal psychological factor contributing to a successful interrogation is privacy, being alone with the person under interrogation. The efficacy of this tactic has been explained as follows. If at all practicable, the interrogation should take place in the investigator's office or at least in a room of his own choice. The subject should be deprived of every psychological advantage. In his own home, he may be confident, indignant, or recalcitrant. He is more keenly aware of his rights and more reluctant to tell of his indiscretions of criminal behavior within the walls of his home. Moreover, his family and other friends are nearby, their presence lending moral support. In his office, the investigator possesses all the advantages. The atmosphere suggests the invincibility of the forces of law. To highlight the isolation and unfamiliar surroundings, the manuals instruct the police to display an air of confidence in the suspect's guilt and from outward appearance to maintain only an interest in confirming certain details. The guilt of the subject is to be posited as a fact. The interrogator should direct his comments towards the reasons why the suspect committed the act, rather than court failure by asking the subject whether he did it. Like other men, perhaps the subject has had a bad family life, had an unhappy childhood, had too much to drink, had unrequited desire for women. The officers are instructed to minimize the moral seriousness of the offense to cast blame on the victim or on society. These tactics are designed to put the subject in a psychological state where his story is but an elaboration of what the police purport to know already, that he is guilty. Explanations to the contrary are dismissed and discouraged. The texts thus stress that the major qualities an interrogator should possess are patience and perseverance. One writer describes the efficacy of these characteristics in this manner. In the preceding paragraphs, emphasis has been placed on kindness and stratagems. The investigator will, however, encounter many situations where the sheer weight of his personality will be the deciding factor. Where emotional appeals and tricks are employed to no avail, he must rely on an oppressive atmosphere of dogged persistence. He must interrogate steadily and without relent, leaving the subject no prospect of surcease. He must dominate his subject and overwhelm him with the inexorable will to obtain the truth. He should interrogate for a spell of several hours, pausing only for the subject's necessities and the acknowledgement of the need to avoid the charge of duress that can be technically substantiated. In a serious case, the interrogation may continue for days, with the required intervals for food and sleep, but with no respite for the atmosphere of domination. it is possible in this way to induce the subject to talk without resorting to duress or coercion. The method should be used only when the guilt of the suspect seems highly probable. The manual suggests that the suspect be offered legal excuses for his action in order to obtain an initial admission of guilt. Where there is a suspected revenge killing, for example, the interrogator may say, "Joe, you probably didn't go out looking for this fellow with the purpose of shooting him. My guess is, however, that you expected something from him, and that's why you carried a gun. For your own protection. You knew him for what it was, no good. Then, when you met with him, he probably started using foul, abusive language, and he gave you some indication that he was about to pull a gun on you, and that's when you had to act to save your own life. Isn't that about it? Isn't it, Joe?" Having then obtained the admission of shooting, the interrogator is advised to refer to circumstantial evidence which negates the self-defense explanation. This should enable him to secure the entire story. One text notes that even if he fails to do so, the inconsistency between the subject's original denial of the shooting and his present admission of at least doing the shooting will serve to provide him of a self-defense out at the time of trial. When the techniques described above prove unavailing, the texts recommend only that it be alternated with some show of hostility. One ploy often used has been termed the friendly unfriendly, or the Mutt and Jeff Act. In this technique, two agents are employed. Mutt, the relentless investigator who knows the subject is guilty and is not going to waste any time, he sent a dozen men away for this crime, and he's going to send the subject away for the full term. Jeff, on the other hand, is obviously a kind-hearted man. He has a family himself. He has a brother who is involved in a little scrape like this. He disapproves of Mutt and his tactics, and he'll arrange to get him off the case if the subject will cooperate. He can't hold Mutt off for very long. The subject would be wise to make a quick decision. The technique is applied by having both investigators present while Mutt acts out of his role. Jeff may stand by quietly and demur at some of Mutt's tactics. When Jeff makes his plea for cooperation, Mutt isn't present in the room. The interrogators are sometimes instructed to induce a confession out of trickery. The technique here is quite effective in crimes which require identification or which run in series. In the identification situation, the interrogator may take a break in his questioning to place the subject among a group of men in a lineup. The witness or complainant, previously coached if necessary, studies the lineup and confidently points out the subject as the guilty party. Then the questioning resumes as though there were no doubt about the guilt. Now no doubt about the guilt of the suspect. A variation on this technique is called the reverse lineup. The accused is placed in a lineup, but this time he's identified by several fictitious witnesses or victims who associated him with different offenses. It's expected that the subject will become desperate and confess to the offense under investigation in order to escape from the false accusations. The manuals also contain instructions for police on how to handle the individual who refuses to discuss the matter entirely, or who asks for an attorney or relatives. The examiner is to concede him the right to remain silent. This usually has a very undermining effect. First of all, he's disappointed in his expectation of an unfavorable reaction on part of the interrogator. Second, a concession of this right to remain silent impresses the subject with the apparent fairness of his interrogator. After psychologically conditioning, however, the officer is told to point out the incriminating significance of the suspect's refusal to talk. "Joe, you have the right to remain silent. That's your privilege, and I'm the last person in the world who's trying to take it away from you. If that's what you want, to leave is okay. But let me ask you this. Suppose we were in my shoes and I was in yours, and you called me and asked about this, and I told you I don't want to answer any of your questions. You'd think I had something to hide, and you'd probably be right. That's exactly what I'll have to think about you, and so will everyone else. Let's just sit here and talk this whole thing over." Few will persist in this initial refusal to talk, it is said, if this monologue is employed correctly. In the event the subject wishes to speak to a relative or an attorney, the following advice is tendered. The interrogator should respond by suggesting that the subject should first tell the truth to the interrogator himself, rather than get anyone else involved in the matter. If the request is for an attorney, the interrogator may suggest that the subject save himself or his family the expense of any such professional service, particularly if he's under investigation particularly if he is innocent of the offense under investigation. The interrogator may also add, Joe, I'm only looking for the truth, and if you're telling the truth, you can handle this by yourself. From these representative samples of interrogation techniques, the setting prescribed by the manuals and observed in practice becomes clear. In essence, it is this: to be alone with the subject is essential to prevent distraction and deprive him of any outside support. The aura of confidence in his guilt undermines his will to resist. He merely confirms the preconceived story the police seek to have him describe. Patience and persistence, at times relentless questioning, are employed. To attain a confession, the interrogator must patiently maneuver himself or his quarry into a position from which the desired objective may be obtained. When normal procedures fail to produce the needed result, the police may resort to deceptive stratagems, such as giving false legal advice. It's important to keep the subject off balance, for example, by trading on his insecurity about himself or his surroundings. The police then persuade, trick, or cajole him out of exercising his constitutional rights. There you have it. Thanks, everybody. That was fun. Let's do it again sometime. Like I said, I think the next one I want to do is called Daniel Retz, and it's a civil rights case in Omaha, Nebraska. No one died, but it involves excessive force by the Omaha Police Department, and it's a pretty wild story. Not as wild as this one, but I hope you like it. Like, subscribe, comment. Tell Wrongful I said hi. Tell Broken Baker I love him. Let me know if you have questions. Let me know if you have heard about this case. That would be fascinating. And watch more of our stuff. We're called New Joel. And we want you to love, dream, smile, and increase the peace.